Donald Trump lives in his own reality and he lies casually, but he's very, very good at it. He used to teach me, Stephanie, as long as you keep repeating something, it doesn't matter what you say. And I will bring us back to 2019 when Hurricane Dorian was coming. And Donald Trump wrote on a map that it was going to hit a part of the country that it wasn't going to really hit, even after being briefed by the National Weather Service. So this is something he's done over and over and over. And I really hope that people will understand that this is just what he does.
Former Forbes reporter says Donald Trump lied to him about his wealth to get onto the Forbes 400 list. But this is really a story about how Trump did this. And we hear the proof in a new audio released by the Washington Post. It is the first known publicly available sound of Mr. Trump posing as his vice president of finance, John Barron. The audio is from 1984, and the journalist is named Jonathan Greenberg. He says Barron tricked him. Take a listen and see if you can tell who it is.
Most of the assets have been consolidated to Mr. Trump, because you have down Fred Trump. And I'd like to talk to you off the record if I can, just to make your thing easier.
Okay, sure.
Is that all right?
Yeah, that's fine.
All right, but I think you can really use Donald Trump now, and you can just consolidate. I think last year somebody showed me the article, and I think you had 200 and 200. And really, it's been pretty well consolidated now for the most part, as I also think somebody had mentioned that you had asked about that, or somebody had, and it's been pretty well consolidated, okay?
Jonathan Greenberg joins us now. Thank you very much for joining us and for taking the time to dig back into the annals of memories/painful memories, and to remember that you might have had tapes of these conversations. People will hear them and say, how could you not know that was Donald Trump? But this was in the 80s, before all the TV, before he was such a nationally, even internationally recognized person. We weren't used to hearing him the way we are today. What made you look back at this?
Well, I had heard him, Chris, because I had interviewed him before he called his John Barron the year before, and yet no one could imagine the unimaginable. No one could imagine that someone would do something like this, call as their own PR person. I heard about Trump, and I looked into my files, and I guess I am something of a pack rat, and I thought I'd like to see those tapes about, the Forbes 400 and the rich list, and I looked, and I was like, wait a minute, this is John Barron, and when I heard them, I thought, these things were much better crafted lies than I thought, and that led me to further research about how much was he really worth in 82, 83, and 84. And it was under $5 million. I put him down for $100 million. He should never have been there in the first place.
You got duped. What made him successful at doing this, in your opinion?
He is a consummate con man. He understood what I was doing, going around the country, putting people on, asking them, and he figured out what he had to do in order to deceive me and get onto that list. And he did it very well. And he maintained that persona of just sort of talking about his assets without any sense of debt and lying about it. He had Roy Cohn call me to lobby for him about his net worth and lie for him. Where is my Roy Cohn? He was there back then, and he was calling Forbes magazine and talking about fictitious income statements. So he knew where we couldn't go, and he went right there and deceived me.
So you have the so what value of this. People have heard this. They haven't heard the tapes the way they will now because of what you've discovered in your own memory bank. But why should people care about what Donald Trump did to try to reestablish his financial prowess all the way back in the 80s?
Well, it shows what he did to the media or as a journalist during his career. He also did to the banks. He basically lied and deceived in order to get his net worth up so he could borrow money, which of course led to the first bankruptcy and the collapse, $3.5 billion, that he borrowed and then collapsed. And he also has done as president. He has, in a way that, just like we weren't prepared for him as the media, I don't think the media was prepared for him as a politician. Like we weren't prepared for him as a businessman. No one is prepared for the level at which of his deception. I used to be proud, Chris, that I was the guy who kept him in check. He said he was worth $500 million. He was only worth $100 million. In fact, He moved the guideposts. He knows how to change the question. Not whether he should be on the Forbes 400, but where he should go, and stopping him from his claims that he's at the very top, worth more than any other real estate tycoon in New York City.
Now, Jonathan, you know me, and you know that ordinarily this is a situation where I might be hammering somebody who's in your position. But I can't. You know why? Too hypocritical. I was in the exact same position when I was at ABC News with a really good investigative team, and he was coming into full flower as Trump, the TV icon, and we did a net worth story about him. And he talked us into a situation where we were only comfortable going to air with what his net worth was if he agreed. And he wound up going up by about 50% every phone call I had with him. And so he didn't even need to have a fake persona. He wasn't even pretending to be somebody else. He's very persuasive, but people will look at this and say, okay, so he's good at it, and guys like Greenberg and Cuomo are dummies, and they go for it, but this is why he's a good businessman. You have to do what you have to do to get there. Fake it till you make it.
That's funny. There's one thing about exaggerating, and there's another thing about sort of totally lying. He lied about there were 25,000 apartments in Brooklyn and Queens and Staten Island. There were 8,000 apartments in Brooklyn and Queens. He lied about his father, that he owned all of his father's assets, and he borrowed against his father's assets, which supposedly were his and had been consolidated. He didn't own any of them till his father died in 1999.
Right.
So banks loaned money. It's hard to imagine that business could be built on this deceit, and that banks could lend on the same, inflated assets with no sense of debt. What we did learn, Chris, is the New Jersey Casino Control Commission in 1981, in a document no one saw for 20 years, did know what he was worth that year. And in fact, it was like he had $1 million trust fund and $400,000 in the bank.
Right.
And it was a complete fabrication.
He deserves credit for building himself back up in an unprecedented way. But how he did it warrants scrutiny, especially now that he's the most powerful man in the world. And we are dealing with his penchant for deception right now. He won't show his taxes. Why? Lots of excuses. We know none of them to be true. Jonathan Greenberg, very important to focus on the nature of the man in power. Thank you very much for giving us this window into your own experience.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, Chris.
I'm the only one on the stage that said we should not go into Iraq.
Are you for invading Iraq?
Yeah, I guess so. I wish it was. I wish the first time it was done correctly.
I will build the wall, and Mexico's going to pay for it, and they'll be happy to pay for it.
I'm not going to pay for that fucking wall.
This guy used a filthy, disgusting word on television, and he should be ashamed of himself, and he should apologize, okay?
Listen, you motherfuckers, we're taxing 25%.
I'm gonna bomb the shit out of them.
We'll beat the shit out of them.
Political bullshit.
You're not gonna raise that fucking price, you understand?
Donald, true or false, you've said the government should pay for everyone's health care.
That's false.
You've never said that.
Everybody's got to be covered.
Universal health care.
I am going to take care of everybody.
Who pays for it?
The government's going to pay for it, but we're going to save so much money on the other side.
Honestly, Carter once said, "I'll never lie to you." Would you say that, the American people?
I would never lie.
When I'm president, I'm a different person. I can do anything. I can be the most politically correct person that you've ever seen. I can be the most politically correct person in the world. And I can be the opposite.
The president has to be a great leader, and you have to lead by example. I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody, and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?
Mr. Trump said he'd be able to eliminate the nation's $19 trillion national debt in just 8 years. And the Post notes that would require slashing the federal budget in half. How is this realistic policy that he can sell to voters?
Well, there are assets. The federal government has assets, too, that you could sell or trade for some of the debt. So
Donald Trump campaigned as if he was going to be the voice of average working people. He said over and over again that he was going to represent the silenced worker of America. Actually, what has happened filled his administration with nominees who are millionaires, multimillionaires, and billionaires, and appointed the most anti-worker Secretary of Labor in modern history.
President-elect Donald Trump turned to former Goldman Sachs banker and movie financier Steve Mnuchin to be the next Treasury Secretary.
Mnuchin has deep ties to Wall Street, including working as a partner for Goldman Sachs, where his father also worked. Under Mnuchin's ownership, IndyMac foreclosed on 36,000 families, particularly elderly residents trapped in reverse mortgages. Mnuchin was accused of running a foreclosure machine.
And 5, to build the Trump International Hotel and Tower in Chicago. Steve Mnuchin's hedge fund also lent money to the project.
Here's some live breaking news. NBC News has just confirmed within the last few moments, confirmed from multiple sources, that the nominee from the Trump administration to be the new Secretary of State will be the CEO of Exxon, Rex Tillerson.
Trump's Commerce Secretary pick Wilbur Ross is a billionaire private equity investor. Ross specializes in flipping bankrupt companies for profit, often buying the U.S. companies at low prices, then selling them to overseas investors.
Steve Mnuchin has said that he will seek to privatize Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac now. That's going to be a huge windfall for the hedge funds.
He said to Reuters, "I would say it'll be close to a dismantling of Dodd-Frank."
He said that once he gets into office, he's going to repeal Dodd-Frank. He's going to loosen financial regulations. So if there was any question about what kind of president Donald Trump is going to be, I think that it was answered last week when executives at Morgan Stanley made $10 million in the immediate days following Donald Trump's victory.
So you're a former Trump University student. Do you believe that it was a fraud, as the Attorney General has said?
Absolutely. No doubt in my mind.
So just as the New York Attorney General has said, you believe that it was a fraud. There were several...
I do believe.
There were several different packages. You want to talk more about that, about why?
Yes. First of all, I signed up for the 3-day introductory seminar at $14.95, and we were told if by the end of the first day that we didn't want to stay for the 3 days, we could have our money refunded. I asked the instructor a lot of direct questions. They completely evaded answering them, so I started getting upset, feeling that this was not an actual learning seminar, but maybe just an upselling seminar. I tried to get my money back, and two other instructors were brought over and basically cornered me, telling me that I just didn't understand the material. I was confused. It's overwhelming. It's real estate. After all, I'm a newbie. If I just stay for 3 days, everything will become clear. So I had a very hard time from the get-go trying to get my money back.
Okay, so $1,495 we're talking about, right? Okay.
That was the initial seminar,
That's not chump change. It's a pretty good chunk of money. So you eventually tried, as you said, to cancel your agreement and try to get your money back, and you fought it. How did that play out?
Well, what happened after that is I didn't receive my money back from the first day seminar, and they had gotten all of our financial information in the first day of the seminar. They, under the guise of working with us to achieve our real estate goals, we were going to become part of the Trump family. We were going to be mentored for a year. That was the gold package, which was $35,000. I didn't sign up for it by the end of the 3 days. However, I was contacted continuously after the seminar.
This is the one this is the gold package, which is $34,995, which is basically $35,000, as you said.
We have this breaking news just into CNN. President-elect Trump just agreed to settle a lawsuit for $25 million. We talked about Trump University a lot during the campaign and how it could be a massive problem for the Trump administration. People who attended the Trump-branded school, you may remember, claimed that they were sold a bill of goods and that they were lied to. The president-elect had filed appeal after appeal, insisting that he did not defraud people who attended Trump U. But now, and again just minutes ago, at a press release, the Attorney General announced the president-elect had agreed to $25 million settlement for the more than 6,000 victims. Trump will also pay up to $1 million in penalties to the state of New York for violating state education laws. All this according to the statement. Of course, Donald Trump has said, he said many times, he never settles. Well, he just settled.
That was another point. That's a very good point. He has indicated previously he doesn't have a proclivity for settling these. Is this a sign of a new Donald Trump. I think there needs to be a lot more evidence before anybody can come to that conclusion.
Donald Trump also has a long career of settling lawsuits,
Right.
so that was never actually true. That was never actually the case. But
Ron, we know the jury has been deliberating for something like 9.5 hours. And just to remind people, this is the criminal tax fraud trial, not implicating Mr. Trump personally, but his business, the Trump Organization, with the star witness here, the former CFO, Alan Weisselberg. This is all about this scheme that prosecutors allege happened, 15-year-long scheme that would basically try to compensate top executives or help these execs avoid paying a... Well, what is it?
Guilty on all counts. We have a verdict. It is guilty on all 17 counts. Just in moments ago, after about 10 hours of deliberations. And you're right, Hallie, this is a case against the Trump Corporation, two entities of the Trump Corporation. There were no named individuals. Former President Donald Trump was not named, but certainly this is his family company. This is his livelihood. This is his business. This is his reputation. This is all things Donald Trump, except him being named as a defendant in this case, you might say. And the jury decided that they were guilty. The Trump Organization was guilty of what the prosecution described as a culture of tax fraud and business record manipulation that stretched some 15 years. Essentially, what you had was the top executives of this corporation, especially Alan Weisselberg, whose name we've heard a lot, who was the chief financial officer of the Trump Corporation for many, many years. His relationship with the family stretched back generations to former President Donald Trump's father he worked with many, many years ago. He had pleaded guilty in another case to 15 counts of tax fraud, and in exchange for a shortened prison sentence, which will be about 5 months, and he testified against the Trump Corporation, saying that this was something that he did on his own. He tried not to implicate the corporation or any other individuals in his testimony, but he was not able to do that, you might argue, because the jury essentially is saying that this was not a rogue operation. This was something that was widespread throughout the company, that the company was involved in, that there were records that were fabricated to try to cover up what they were doing. Essentially, Weisselberg and others were being paid perks, luxury apartments, vehicles, tuition for his grandkids' schooling, which totaled hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, and they were being paid off the books. In other words, they weren't paying taxes on this income, on these benefits. So they were essentially defrauding the IRS, defrauding New York State Department of Tax, and the taxpayers who live in all of us generally is what the charge was, to the tune of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. The company also benefited because they didn't pay payroll taxes on this revenue, you might say. So they were able to conceal and hide hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars along the way over 15 years. Now, the penalty is a fine, essentially, of $1.7 million. However, there's no jail time for any of the corporate entities. However, as we were saying a little while ago, this is part of a larger 3-year investigation of the Trump Corporation by the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. The continuing part of this investigation focuses squarely at Donald Trump as a businessman and his business practices. There's been a lot of speculation about whether that investigation has been dormant or not. There were a couple of prosecutors who resigned earlier this year saying that they thought there was evidence, that there was adequate evidence to indict the former president. The DA here, who's been very tight-lipped and newly elected, Alvin Bragg, has said that he is continuing the investigation. He has not said that it is on or off. About earlier this week, he hired a new prosecutor who has a record of in the New York Attorney General's office of going after Donald Trump in the past, leading to speculation that this criminal investigation might be getting more energy. But again, that's speculation at this point. But the bottom line today is that the Trump Corporation has been found guilty of widespread systemic tax fraud over a long period of time, over 15 years.
In just one day this week, President Trump said at least 3 lies. But his problem with telling the truth is not something new, of course. It spans decades. And CNN's chief political analyst, Gloria Borger, joins us now with more. You've looked into this. You must have been busy.
I was very busy, you know, because those troubles with the truth run the gamut from his father's birthplace to his slot machines in Atlantic City. And it is a very bad habit that he takes with him wherever he goes. One day, 3 Whoppers. Even for Donald Trump, impressive.
My father is German, right? Was German. And born in a very wonderful place in Germany.
Fred Trump was born in New York City. And then there's his latest suggestion of election fraud, all but saying the 2018 midterms were rigged by the Democrats.
There were a lot of close elections they seemed to, every single one of them went Democrat. If it was close, they say the Democrat, well, there's something going on, fella. You got to, but we have to be a little bit careful because I don't like the way the votes are being tallied. I don't like it.
He doesn't like wind turbines either.
And they say the noise causes cancer. You tell me that one, okay?
Even his staff couldn't figure that one out.
I don't have an answer in that. I mean, I don't have an answer to that.
All just the latest additions to more than 9,000 false or misleading claims made by this president, according to the Washington Post fact-checkers. As Donald Trump himself said last year,
what you're seeing and what you're reading is not what's happening.
Donald Trump has had a fraught relationship with the truth, one that goes back decades, to the building and selling of Trump Tower, where Barbara Rez managed the construction.
He planted that Princess Di was looking for an apartment in Trump Tower.
And that didn't happen?
No.
Oh.
But it made the papers.
Sure. So veracity wasn't a part of it. It was just getting the buzz out there about Trump. Did you guys laugh at it, or?
Yeah. Because there was nothing so terrible about it. I mean, you know, it was kind of like puffing. You know, it was like exaggerating.
Tony Schwartz, co-author of Trump's Art of the Deal, has a name for this.
I came up with this phrase, truthful hyperbole, which is, you know, I called it an innocent form of exaggeration. Now I can call something that I actually sold for $2 million, I can say $10 million, and that becomes truthful hyperbole. The problem is that there is no such thing as truthful hyperbole. The truth is the truth. Hyperbole is a lie. They don't go together.
And they didn't go together during the troubled opening of Trump's Atlantic City Taj Mahal Casino in 1990, when some of the slots didn't work.
When the Casino Control Commission went down there on opening day to check out that all the things had been done, many things hadn't been done. They shut down a third of the slots.
Slots that were critical to the casino's success.
The slots are the prime revenue producer of the casino. To shut down the third on opening day was both humiliating and financially disastrous. And it was only done because he doesn't have an organization in depth.
But that wasn't the story Trump told.
Something could go bad, like the opening of the Taj, and he would say, it's because we had so much business here that this happened. Not that the systems broke down, not that we didn't know what we were doing. We had so much business it broke down. Truly, he just would lie about everything.
And he did.
What about the slot machine thing where they were down for a while?
The slots were so hot. Nobody's seen people play that hard and that fast.
So what, it blew out the slots literally?
They blew apart. We had machines
that too much
they were
fuse?
virtually on fire.
Donald is so wrapped up in hyperbole that it's almost constant lies. You know, whether it's the littlest things where, you know, if you had 2,000 people at an event, you know, he would say there were 5,000 people at an event.
Lying when there seems to be no reason to lie.
There's no belief system. If it will work, I will say it. If it stops working, I'll say it's opposite, and I will not feel any compunction about saying it's opposite because I don't believe anything in the first place.
Lying when it's in his political interest, as he did last July after his disastrous press conference with Vladimir Putin, trying to walk back this remark on election interference.
My people came to me, Dan Coates came to me, and some others. They said they think it's Russia. I have President Putin. He just said it's not Russia. I will say this, I don't see any reason why it would be. In a key sentence in my remarks, I said the word would instead of wouldn't. The sentence should have been, I don't see any reason why I wouldn't, or why it wouldn't be Russia.
Seeing it from his perspective doesn't make a distinction between what's true and what's false. His only distinction is what will work and what will not work.
And what happens when he's challenged with facts? What does he do?
He has a genius, perverse genius for turning any situation into something that is evidence of his brilliance, even if it's not true.
And one more thing about Donald Trump's father, who was really born in New York, as we said. In The Art of the Deal, Trump says he was born in New Jersey.
Yes. Hello, I'm Ivanka Trump. Welcome to Trump Ocean Club International Hotel and Tower, Panama.
It was the first Trump-branded tower to go up overseas, with Ivanka Trump pitching it.
Or you can opt to dine on your private balcony.
Luxurious, yes, but like many real estate projects in Panama, also a magnet for dirty money, according to insiders and a former Panamanian prosecutor. An NBC News investigation in conjunction with Reuters reveals brokers and buyers included Russian gangsters and a money launderer for Latin American drug cartels. Alexander Ventura was one of the tower's main brokers.
I had some customers with some, questionable background.
What does that mean?
I mean, I found out later, not in the beginning, from belongs to mafia, the Russian mafia, or things like that.
Ventura is now a fugitive accused of fraud. We agreed to disguise his appearance.
Did the Trump organization want to know who these buyers were, where the money was coming from?
No, not that I'm aware of. No, not at all.
Monty Friesner was in Panama at the time units at the Trump Ocean Club were being sold. He's a convicted former money launderer and knows Ventura and his partners.
So Ventura was marketing the Trump Ocean Club as part of a real estate portfolio where corrupt people could park their money.
You got it.
And they did.
Yeah. But they didn't just park their money was turned over consistently.
A former Panamanian prosecutor who investigated the building confirmed to us it did draw in people with a criminal history. Asked for comment, the White House and Ivanka Trump's team both referred us to the Trump Organization. In a statement, it said the Trump Organization was not the owner, developer, or seller of the Trump Ocean Club Panama project, and that the organization has no relationship with Ventura or knowledge of the allegations against him.
I believe this is the picture of you with President Trump.
Yes, that's correct. That's Mar-a-Lago, yes. Yeah.
So you were a guest at the party, they hosted you at Mar-a-Lago.
Yes.
The Trump Organization is now distancing itself from a project that earned it millions in association with a dubious cast of characters. Financial documents show that the president is still making money from this building, lighting up the sky here in Panama City.
Good to see you both, David. I want to start with you. Talk to me. I mean, this is not the first time that Donald Trump has fraternized someone with the likes of Fuentes, and yet it can absolutely never become normalized.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Alicia. I think everybody can make their own judgment about Donald Trump, the man, and what's in his heart. But what we do know is there's a pattern of giving aid and comfort to racist, to anti-Semitic individuals, to bigots, and that's true at Mar-a-Lago just this week. I think, look, we're overlooking the fact that he also had dinner with Kanye coming out of the last 4 to 6 weeks. This has not been a good moment for Kanye's personal convictions either. So for Donald Trump to plead ignorance just simply doesn't make any sense whatsoever. There is a pattern of this that was affirmed. The bigger question, does it matter for Republicans? I think the silence is fairly interesting. Mm-hmm. Look, you've got a whole bunch of Republicans hoping that this is the end of Donald Trump, but they're not willing to be the ones to place their bet on that. So if Donald Trump emerges in the Republican primary as the front runner, expect them all to get right back behind him like they did 4 years ago.
Juanita, your thought on this guest list?
Look, it's no surprise. Trump ran on white supremacy and anti-Semitism and bigotry in 2016 and 2020, and that's clearly the plan in 2024 as he unites anti-Semites and white supremacists at Mar-a-Lago. It's disgusting, but it's par for the course. What's also par for the course that David mentioned was the fact that Republicans haven't said anything. And honestly, everybody who had smoke for Trump after they lost their races through him and his handpicked candidates needs to speak up, because ultimately they're showing that they have no backbones. They're showing that they're still cowards. They're showing that they will still cower to Trump in 2024. So whatever that pipe dream of Republicans turning on Trump, kiss it goodbye. They're showing yet again they're sticking with him by not calling him out. And honestly, this is dangerous and it's only going to continue to escalate. So I appreciate you showing that tweet from Representative Torres, because he knows what's up. He's calling it out for what it is. Not only is Trump using these people as his closest advisors when everybody else seems to be abandoning him, but he is who he plans to lean on, especially when he tries to appeal to his white supremacist, racist base.
He may disavow them all he likes, but Donald Trump's allure to racist is rearing its ugly head in these final days of this contentious campaign. Last night, a mob scene in New Orleans after the former KKK leader and current U.S. Senate candidate squeaked into a debate on a black college campus. David Duke is one of Donald Trump's biggest and least welcomed fans in Louisiana. Duke is barely getting 5% in the polls, but it was enough to get him on a debate stage and voice his admiration for Donald Trump.
I will be Donald Trump's most loyal advocate to make sure his nominees go to the Supreme Court.
Mark Potok with the Southern Poverty Law Center says racist groups of the past have gotten new life, like it or not, from Trump.
I think from the point of view of the radical right, Donald Trump has been playing a careful little game of footsie with them since the very beginning of the campaign. I think they feel clearly that Trump is essentially on their side, if not precisely holding the same views.
Joe Biden's 5 million illegal aliens are on the verge of replacing you.
The government of this country is on course to replace us with non-Europeans, non-white people.
That's right. They want you to disappear.
We need to actually get up and fight for the white race, or there ain't going to be no white race.
They care more about the illegal immigrants at the border than they do the American people. They're giving out handouts to them.
Our country just don't care about us Americans. It's all about a handout to all the illegal immigrants.
If you're white, you have to go to the back of the line, discriminating against white people.
There is racial discrimination going on right now in this country against massive numbers of white Americans.
Quite frankly, he tries to make white people second-class citizens.
White Americans are being treated as second-class citizens.
There are now two standards of justice.
The dual system of justice.
How precisely is diversity our strength?
So how is diversity our strength?
I wanted to ask you about a New York Times report long ago in 1927 that your grandfather, Donald Trump's father, Fred Trump, was arrested at a Ku Klux Klan riot in Queens, New York. The article is subtitled "Klan Assails Policemen." It reports that 1,000 Klansmen and 100 policemen staged a free-for-all battle. It lists Fred Trump with his address as one of 7 men who were arrested and arraigned for the assault. Charges against him were dropped. New York Police Commissioner Warren is quoted in the article saying the Klan not only wore gowns but had hoods over their faces, almost completely hiding their identity. The report was found and published in 2015 by the website Boing Boing. In a New York Times interview about the discovery, your uncle, Donald Trump, said, "I saw that it was one little website that said it. It never happened. They said there were no charges, no nothing. It's unfair to mention it, to be honest, because there were no charges. They said there were charges against other people, but there were absolutely no charges. Totally false," he said. But we're going back to that 2017 report in the New York Times. Do you know about this, Mary Trump? Did you hear about it as you were growing up?
No, I didn't. Although, my family wasn't great at telling stories. But, unlike Donald, I don't doubt the validity of the report. It would be kind of a random thing to make up 60 years ago or 80 years ago, whenever it was. The only thing that surprises me, because, my family was quite anti-Semitic, along with other things. So the only thing that surprises me is that my grandfather would take time away from his business to go to anything, honestly. But it wouldn't surprise me that he shared the sentiment.
Did you ever hear Donald Trump, your uncle, use the N-word?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, sure.
Well, you know, I know that sounds awful to put it that way, but when you live in a family, and you know you're a kid, it's not that I didn't know it was wrong. I did, because I lived a very different kind of experience growing up. You know, I lived in Jamaica, Queens, which was you know, lower class, working class, and predominantly African American. I went to a school that was predominantly Jewish. So I didn't understand the animus, but it wasn't shocking because it's just the way it was. This is how adults in my orbit spoke and behaved. And now, of course, you know, I learned a long time ago that it wasn't just something I disagreed with, but it was deeply wrong. But you know, I guess I say it the way I say it is just to underscore how casual and accepted it was. As far as my grandfather, he was basically the only person in the family whose opinion mattered. He had all of the power. You know, it was a very patriarchal system I grew up in. There was a lot of misogyny, so being a girl in that family was an automatic strike against you. And my grandfather was the kind of man who believed in dynasty in a way. I mean, he wouldn't have put it in those terms, but you know, he had his real estate empire, and his oldest son and namesake, my father, was going to be his successor, and his empire was going to last in perpetuity. Unfortunately, for my father's sake, he wasn't the right kind of person in my grandfather's eyes. My grandfather needed somebody who was a killer, who was a tough guy, somebody who would win at all costs and was not weak in any way. In my family, being kind was considered being weak. Admitting your mistakes and apologizing for them was equated with weakness as well. So I don't know exactly when it happened, but at some point, certainly I would imagine by the time my dad was in college, my grandfather already knew that he was probably not going to cut it as his heir apparent. So Donald, who was 7.5 years younger, learned from my grandfather's psychological and emotional abuse of my dad. And the message was essentially, don't be like Freddie. And since my grandfather ran my family as a zero-sum game, and there could only be one winner and everybody else was a loser, Donald was determined to win. And he, in my grandfather's eyes at least, did, and, you know, has successfully auditioned as my dad's replacement.
Thank you for joining us. I'm here with the prosecutors and investigators who have worked diligently on the investigation of criminal attempts to interfere in the administration of Georgia's 2020 presidential election. Today, based on information developed by that investigation, a Fulton County grand jury returned a true bill of indictment, charging 19 individuals with violations of Georgia law arising from a criminal conspiracy to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election in this state. The indictment includes 41 felony counts and is 97 pages long. Please remember that everyone charged in this bill of indictment is presumed innocent. Specifically, the indictment brings felony charges against Donald John Trump, Rudolph William Louis Giuliani, John Charles Eastman, Mark Randall Meadows, John Cheeseborough, Jeffrey Clark, Jenna Lynn Ellis, Ray Stallings Smith III, Robert David Cheeley, Michael A. Roman, David James Schaefer, Sean Micah Tresher Steele, Stephen Cliffgard Lee, Harrison William Prescott Floyd, Travion C. Cootie, Sydney Catherine Powell, Kathleen Austin Latham, Scott Graham Hall, and Misty Hampton, also known as Emily Misty Hayes.
Turns out the former leader does not snap his fingers and command a nationwide crippling uprising in his or her name. I mean, even in our country, where he promised he would, where he promised that would happen, where he overtly, publicly tried to make it happen, it failed. He failed. He wanted that. He promised it. He was counting on it. And therefore, a lot of the country was counting on that being a consequence of this part of the process. It hasn't happened. The dog did not bark. And so that does sort of settle one big part of this existential question for us at this crime scene, right? This existential question for our country and our democracy, for our form of government. Will we be able to survive bringing criminal charges against this particular alleged criminal, given his political power and his hold on his followers? Will we be able to try a man for his alleged crimes without riots in the streets, without the threat of civil war? Turns out, yes, we can. Despite what he threatened to do, despite what he promised to do, he tried to do it. He could not pull it off, which is good news for our democracy. The bad news is that instead, we're getting something else. Not mass violence again, like we saw on January 6th, not even mass protest. But instead, what we are getting is individual acts, both violence and threats of violence, by radicalized people and groups that support him. We saw it last year when a man who was enraged by the Mar-a-Lago search warrant shot his way into an Ohio FBI office and was then killed in a shootout outside Cincinnati. We saw it a week and a half ago when another armed man was shot and killed by the FBI, this time in Utah, when they served a search warrant and arrest warrant on him in response to his threats to kill President Biden, and also New York prosecutor Alvin Bragg, who had brought the first indictment against Donald Trump. Then last week, a Massachusetts man pled guilty in federal court that after the election, he sent bomb threats, death threats to this Arizona official, to Katie Hobbs, who was then the Democratic Secretary of State in Arizona and who is now the Democratic Governor of Arizona. That man pled guilty in federal court last week. He will be facing 5 years in prison when he is sentenced this fall. Then it was Alvin, Texas last week, a woman arrested for phoning in a death threat to the chambers of the federal judge who is overseeing the other federal case against Trump in federal district court in Washington. The woman admitted threatening to kill the judge and then also volunteered another death threat to federal agents, saying she would also kill Texas Democratic Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. She reportedly told agents she did not intend to go to Washington, D.C. to carry out her death threat against the judge, although she did make the threat. But she told them she absolutely would kill Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee when Sheila Jackson Lee came home to Texas. Then it was a weird, attenuated story, sort of announcement out of Reno, Nevada on Friday. Hazmat teams and robots called in to respond to a cup of white powder and a threatening sign left outside the Reno, Nevada FBI office. And of course, it's all the news from Fulton County, Georgia, where pro-Trump online message boards started immediately after his indictment there, circulating names and purported addresses and phone numbers and photos of the grand jurors who handed down the Trump indictment in Georgia, prompting the Fulton County Sheriff's Office to announce that it was investigating threats made to the grand jurors. That soon gave way to the news that the FBI would be joining the Sheriff's Department investigation of those threats to the grand jurors. Soon gave way to news that the sheriff himself was being threatened and that was now under investigation, which soon gave way to news that security had also had to be increased around prosecutor Fani Willis and her office because of threats to her. Now tonight, CNN reporting that employees of the Fulton County Sheriff's Office are themselves being threatened, including their homes and their families being threatened by Trump supporters. Tonight, they've announced a total lockdown on the streets around the Fulton County Jail for when former President Trump turns up there this week to surrender himself and get booked, which he says will happen on Thursday. But honestly, at this point, do we really expect big street protests on behalf of Trump? I think we don't. I think we don't expect that. I think that dog has not barked. We don't expect big street protests on his behalf. We expect terrorism, or at least terroristic threats.
I want to go through the records of Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. How would you characterize Donald Trump and what he represents, from foreign policy to domestic politics, specifically what he is saying that he would do as president of the United States?
Well, you don't know what he's going to do, and he doesn't know what he's going to do. He's basically wondering how he ever got to the top of the Republican Party and turned it into the Trump dump. He has no impulse control. He has no factual content in his head. He doesn't really know much about anything other than being a gambling casino czar that goes bankrupt and creams off the crop and leaves the devastation to the workers and the creditors and the small business suppliers. Donald Trump has cheated everybody he has been able to cheat. He's cheated workers, small businesses, taxpayers. He's cheated creditors. And almost everything he attacks people for, he has done in spades. He refuses to release his tax returns because it not only shows he hardly pays any taxes, and he's a corporate welfare king, getting all kinds of freebies from the taxpayer, but he has entanglements with his partnerships all over the country and the world that may prove very embarrassing to him. So this is what the Republican Party has reaped by allowing the electoral process to be commercialized and corporatized. So if you say, what is he going to do? The one thing we know is if anybody dares offend his ego, they're going to get a lashback. And when you've got your hand on a nuclear button and you've got the kind of power you have in the White House, that's a very dangerous option.
Talk about some of his domestic policies. For example, the New York Times investigation has found Donald Trump has received at least $885 million in New York City tax breaks for his real estate projects since 1980. The Times also reports Trump successfully sued 3 mayoral administrations when the city sought to deny him tax breaks for a pair of Trump skyscrapers. You must have read that front page story. Yes. For his supporters, they may say the man uses the loopholes, which means he knows the loopholes, and then he'll close the loopholes. Is that true? It's
interesting. The millions of his supporters would be very, very critical of a neighbor that worked the welfare system unfairly. And he's a corporate welfare king. He's a freeloader. He's a freeloader on the backs of taxpayers who have to make up the difference for the taxes he doesn't pay or get less public services. So to the Trump supporters who are believed to take any criticism of Trump personally, to them, I say, reduce Trump to a neighbor and see if you'd really want to live next to that man who is a boastful, pontificating, empty suit, and who lies as a matter of conviction rather than just principle.
Last week, the Trump campaign proposed cutting back on food safety regulations, arguing they're burdensome to farmers and, quote, overkill. But the campaign later deleted the proposal from its website and offered no explanation. In fact, in the fact sheet, the campaign had said, quote, The FDA food police, which dictate how the federal government expects farmers to produce fruits and vegetables and even dictates the nutritional content of dog food, unquote. The statement went on to say, quote, the rules govern the soil farmers use, farm and food production hygiene, food packaging, food temperatures, and even what animals may roam, which fields and when. It also greatly increased inspections of food facilities and levies new taxes to pay for this inspection overkill. That was the fact sheet that's no longer on the website. Your response?
Well, maybe someone who runs Trump hotels says you better have strong regulation of food, otherwise your guests are going to come down with contaminated food sickness. That's part of his lashing out. He's trying to appeal to the corporations that are now funding him after he said nobody funds him. He funds his own campaign. This is the Trump campaign tells a lot about the failure of our educational system, where millions of people come out of our schools and either unwilling or unable to separate truth from fiction and lies from propaganda. It also, the Trump campaign tells us that there's no level of degradation that the mass media will not descend to in order to make a profit with high ratings covering his bombastic, wild statements against people. It's interesting, he keeps saying crooked Hillary. We're the Democrats to give him his nickname, Cheating Donald. I even wrote a column on this. You go to nader.org. He's cheated everything he's touched over the years.
Let's be specific.
Yeah, well, for example, he's gone bankrupt deliberately 4 or 5 times in his Atlantic City and other casinos because he rakes off the cream from the bankruptcy and he gets rid of his debts. So he's cheating his creditors. He's cheating his workers who are left on the street. With Trump University, he's cheated his students. That's now in litigation. He's cheated the taxpayers because anybody who's a corporate welfare king is a freeloader on the backs of middle-class taxpayers who have to pay their taxes. And he's boastfully cheated on matrimony. Imagine a guy boasting about cheating in the past on his own matrimony. You have evangelicals supporting him. You see, he is doing us a favor by showing us the degree of disintegration in our society.
As we cover this historic arraignment of former President Donald Trump, we look at what he has not been charged with, well, at least yet. We're joined on the phone by Ralph Nader, longtime consumer advocate, corporate critic, former presidential candidate many times. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Ralph. Your response to what took place yesterday, it was historic, first ever ex or sitting president charged, criminally charged. He's charged with 34 felonies. And he also has been impeached twice. But talk about what he did get charged with and what he didn't.
Well, it was historic in the sense it was massively overdue. Let's start with Donald Trump's notorious statement in 2019, which lays the basis for his lawlessness day after day as president. He said, quote, with Article 2, I can do whatever I want as president, end quote. Really? But he went on to prove it before 2019 when he made the statement and after. And so the broader frame of reference here is that he turned the White House into a daily crime scene. John Bolton, who was his special assistant, in his memoir said obstruction of justice in the White House was a way of life. That's a serious crime. In the Mueller report, they outlined 10 major obstruction of justice against law enforcement in a very crude manner. There wasn't any subtlety about it. But what Trump has done openly, brazenly, there's nothing furtive like Nixon about Trump, is that in the White House, he set a historic record for defying over 150 congressional subpoenas. That's criminal contempt. He got away with it. He shoveled around billions of dollars from one program to another, most notoriously from military housing projects to extend the wall on the Mexican border. That is a violation of a criminal law called the Anti-Deficiency Act. He got away with it. He used the White House as a political re-election base, had events there openly right on the White House lawn, and forced the Treasury Department to put his name on millions of checks going out during the pandemic to millions of Americans. That is a crime. It violates the criminal prohibition in the Hatch Act from using the power of the federal government against your electoral opponents. He got away with it. It's important to say also that all presidents violate laws. He's just taking it to a new and diverse height. But he's doing it so brazenly that if he gets away with it, he will continue to contribute to the institutionalization of lawlessness by presidents of the United States. Let's face it, both Bush, Obama, and Trump have violated all kinds of laws in extending the empire. Obama, for example, decreed informally that he could pick out anybody in the world, and as prosecutor, judge, jury, executioner, and in secret, wiped that person out, and he did it. Of course, Bush was the big war criminal with Cheney invading Iraq. But then Obama took out the regime in Libya without a congressional debate, without a congressional authorization, appropriation of funds, or declaration of war. And that's, to this day, producing chaos and violence, goaded by Secretary of State Clinton, who pushed Obama to do this, and he later admitted it was his biggest mistake of his administration. So we have all kinds of other tax violations, obstruction of voting, campaign finance violations, never mind his assault and battery of women, which he seemed to be proud of. So this event yesterday represents the first turnaround. Why did Democrats wait so long? They had 12 impeachable offenses in 2019. We got them in the congressional record, December 19th. Congressman John Larson put them in. Nancy Pelosi just went with the Ukraine matter, not exactly a kitchen table issue affecting millions of Americans. They had much better issues. So you had one party letting the other party get away with it, in part because the Democrats also violated laws at the presidential level. So I think the American people have got to see this as an opportunity, a gateway to reverse the process where presidents are above the law. They have been above the law. People around the world have suffered and died because these presidents have been above the law. So we have to broaden it out, because what the GOP is going to try to do is focus on yesterday and Alvin Bragg's prosecution, when the criminal lawlessness of
Ralph,
Trump
I wanted to ask you about Trump's. Ralph, I wanted to ask you about Trump's attacks on the IRS, and especially since probably his most consistent historical violations have been in evading his own the taxes, his personal taxes, and those of his companies. Could you talk about that?
Well, yes, David K. Johnson's written about this. He was on your program yesterday. He's been under regular audit year after year by the IRS. There never seems to be any resolution. It turned out that the IRS was so strapped in its budget, it just had one auditor on this massive commercial sprawling empire of Trump, using every possible tax evasion, tax avoidance system imaginable. So he really has gotten away with that. But worse, apropos your question, is he worked with the Republicans year after year in starving the IRS budget so that it couldn't have the skilled auditors to go after the tax evasion of the super rich and the multinational corporations. In fact, one study out of Berkeley pointed out that over 20% of the top super rich Americans in the United States were evading billions and billions of dollars of taxes, and the IRS was handcuffed. And to this day, the IRS is under pressure by the Republicans going after their budget. Fortunately, they don't control the Senate, so they can't get it through. But clearly, the Trump and the Republican Party were actively and purposely engaged in aiding and abetting tax evasion by the super rich and corporations, all kinds of money that could have gone to good works in our country.
As we're reporting, a Georgia grand jury has voted to indict former President Donald Trump and 18 of his allies stemming from the investigation by Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis into their attempt to overturn the 2020 Georgia election. This is the fourth time in just over 4 months a grand jury has indicted Trump. In March, Trump became the first former U.S. president to ever be charged with a crime and was arraigned in New York on 34 felonies related to paying hush money to adult film star Stormy Daniels during the 2016 presidential campaign. Then June, Donald Trump becomes the first president to face federal criminal charges as a grand jury in Florida indicts him over the mishandling of classified documents after leaving. Then earlier this month, Donald Trump's indicted on 4 counts: conspiracy to defraud the United States, conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding, tampering with a witness, and conspiracy against the civil rights of citizens, the right of their vote to be counted. The indictment centering on Trump's efforts to stay in office after Joe Biden defeated him in the November election. For more, we're joined by Ralph Nader, longtime consumer advocate, corporate critic, former presidential candidate. His recent piece for Truthdig is headlined, "Jack Smith is one step short of the full case against Trump." So first, Ralph, if you could respond to what took place last night, just before midnight in Georgia, the significance of these state charges against Trump and 18 others, these RICO charges. And then let's go back one to Jack Smith and your critique of the charges that he brought.
Well, it's the fourth indictment in just a few weeks of Donald Trump in Georgia. It's quite a strong case. They have him on record calling the Secretary of State to find votes to overturn the state election results in Georgia in the 2020 presidential campaign. But going back to Jack Smith, we should remember that that Trump could be convicted on all these accounts and still run for president and still get elected for president with a minority of voters because of the Electoral College atrocity and because the Republicans have succeeded in suppressing so many or intimidating so many voters in swing states. So the only criminal prohibition that would disqualify Donald Trump from the ballot is Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, called the insurrection section, and it was made into a criminal violation by the federal code a number of years later. And Section 3 is very clear. It categorically disqualifies from public office at any level of government any official who, after taking an oath to support the Constitution of the United States, engages in insurrection against it. And the definition of insurrection fits Donald Trump's multiple behaviors. It means seeking by force, violence, or otherwise to frustrate the ability of the United States to enforce the Constitution and laws. And what is more important than to basically count judicially certified state electoral votes in the U.S. Congress by the Vice President, in this case, Mike Pence? Well, one thing about Trump's being a serial law violator is that he does it day after day. He does it overtly. He does it brazenly. Here's the person who said in July 2019, quote, "Then I have Article 2 where I have the right to do anything I want as president," end quote. He later insisted that the Constitution should be, quote, "terminated," end quote, by shouts of massive electoral fraud, which was false. He basically told Trump on January 6th, "You have to choose between me, Donald Trump, and the Constitution." So in addition to all the federal criminal statutes that he's violated, in addition to obstruction of justice being a way of life in the White House, according to his former special assistant, John Bolton, and obstruction of justice, as we know, is a federal crime, he has flouted the Constitution. And so we're left with Jack Smith bringing 3 counts, but not bringing the 4th count, an insurrection. He has a huge amount of evidence. The House Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol made a criminal referral to the Justice Department recommending prosecution of Trump for assisting or aiding the January 6th insurrection. Even more specifically, before that, Amy, when Trump was impeached the second time by the House of Representatives, he was impeached for, among other things, inciting insurrection. A majority of the House voted for it. It was sent to the Senate. A majority voted in the Senate, 57 to 43, but with some Republicans, I might add, but it didn't reach the two-thirds requirement for conviction under the Constitution. So the question is, why did Jack Smith and Merrick Garland omit this? And I'm not sure it was Jack Smith. It could have been Merrick Garland overruling Jack Smith. None of them are talking about why they omitted the insurrection count. And I think a speculation is that they don't want to go to the next stage and infuriate Trump's supporters, and riots in the streets and all.
Ralph, isn't some of the criticism or the support for not doing insurrection that he wanted an elegant, very simple series of charges that he could, where especially if he is the first case that goes to court, where Donald Trump could conceivably been convicted. And the fact that he only went after Donald Trump himself, I mean, this one is Donald Trump and 18 others, will take much longer. What about that? The issue of the elegance and the simplicity of the charges he brought that could make it more realizable in the near future before he could possibly be elected the next president of the United States.
We should remember, Amy, that Trump's lawyers are masters of delay. They already have a Trump nominee for federal court, Judge Aileen Cannon in Florida, putting off the trial until May after the primaries, till May of next year. Already, the trials for Jack Smith are in December, and they can be moved even more. So we're dealing here with awful delay, and we're dealing with a candidate who can basically create mobs in the streets, threats everywhere as he runs for office, intimidating members of his own party as well as other Americans. So there's nothing more elegant than an insurrection account because the evidence is already there. It's been brought together in great detail by the House Select Committee on January 6th, and it's been brought together by the impeachment proceedings by the House of Representatives in 2021. We should realize here that what Trump is doing is committing assault day by day. When you use the kind of language, violent language, that he uses against individuals named, in effect, with threats of violence, that is a crime itself. You don't have to go to battery. This assault is a crime itself, as he did to the two election workers in Georgia. But he's been escaping the law all his life. I've often said he could give a seminar in a law school on how he escaped the law as a corporate executive, he escaped the law as president, and he's in the process of trying to do it again. He's violated all kinds of federal criminal statutes when he was in president. He used the White House lawn as an open political campaign site. That violates the criminal statute, the Hatch Act, 5-year jail term. If you get convicted, he got away with that. He got away with all kinds of obstruction of justice following the Mueller report that came out. He got away with 11 impeachment counts that Nancy Pelosi didn't want to bring. She just brought the Ukraine matter, not exactly a kitchen table issue.
Ralph, let me ask you about what he's now been charged with. I mean, he's been, so far in these 4 cases, in these 4 indictments, he's been charged for what he did before he was president, while he was president, after he was president. He's been charged where he used to live in New York, where he now lives in Florida, where he worked in Washington, D.C., and now in Georgia. And I wanted to ask you about this comment in the Times. As they did in Manhattan, Trump's lawyers are likely to argue that the Georgia case should be moved to federal court because it concerns acts he took as president and so falls under federal jurisdiction. That argument failed in New York, where the indictment focused on the hush money payment because it happened before he was president. The significance of this coming out of Georgia, Ralph.
The significance is all the process delay, constant delay into 2024, before the election, after the election. That's why the insurrection count is so important. It's the only one that will prevent him from running for public office. So we've written on Jack Smith a draft letter, which I hope other lawyers will sign, urging him to go back to the grand jury, as he can do, with the approval of Merrick Garland, and add the insurrection account. Add the insurrection count.
A superseding
to the
indictment.
Yes.
And
Pardon?
what kind of response have you gotten to this?
No, this is a draft letter that we're circulating to get lawyers to come on board. The real problem here is that Trump is a soliloquist. He attacks everybody, and he knows that the law enforcement people, the prosecutors, cannot respond. And all these other groups in our society that he has menaced and undermined and harmed are keeping quiet. Where are the lawyers? Where are the bar associations? Keeping quiet. Where are the labor unions? Keeping quiet. Where are the peace groups? Keeping quiet. Where are the women groups? They should, day after day, rebut him. The children's protection groups, the environmental groups, where are the civil rights groups? Once in a while they speak out, but he's on the news every day, and he has to be rebutted every day. Things have deteriorated so much in terms of the rule of law, Amy, that in 2005, 2006, the American Bar Association issued 3 white papers accusing George W. Bush of violating the Constitution during the Iraq War. And now they're silent. The biggest bar association in the world. It was supposed to be a first responder against the crushing of the rule of law by a president and an ex-president, and they're silent. So unless these groups speak out, the religious groups don't speak out. There's a reason why they're not speaking out, because a minority of their membership are fervid Trump supporters. And they don't want to have that kind of internal turmoil. I was told that by the head of the National Council of Churches a few years ago.
So Donald Trump is now threatening to sue the New York Times. At issue, they're reporting on this answer to a question at his press conference yesterday about this man, former San Francisco Mayor Willie Brown, a former mentor to Vice President Kamala Harris and someone she dated in the mid-90s.
I know Willie Brown very well. In fact, I went down in a helicopter with him. We thought maybe this is the end. We were in a helicopter going to a certain location together, and there was an emergency landing. This was not a pleasant landing, and Willie was, he was a little concerned.
So the Times today reported there are just a few things wrong with this story. One, they say Willie Brown was not on the helicopter, and two, it did not almost crash. It was this guy, then California Governor Jerry Brown, who was on the helicopter, says the Times, which also reports that the former president was on that helicopter flight with the governor to inspect wildfire damage. Then Governor-elect Gavin Newsom, who was also on board, told the Times that there was no emergency landing. And Newsom said if anyone was talking about the helicopter crashing, it was Donald Trump. Well, late today, Trump called a Times reporter, claimed to have flight records to verify his story, and shouted that he was, quote, probably going to sue. Now, when asked, however, to produce the flight records, he instead repeated the question back in what the Times' Maggie Haberman describes as a sing-song voice. Mockingly is how she describes it. So, more to come on this. Shortly before airtime, I spoke with Willie Brown. Mayor Brown, thank you so much for being with us this evening. Just to clear things up, have you ever been in a helicopter that made an emergency landing with Donald Trump?
No.
Have you ever been in a helicopter with Donald Trump?
No.
He is apparently tonight getting angry about all of this. calling the New York Times and berating them for their story on this, claiming, he says, we have the flight records of the helicopter, and apparently said the helicopter landed in a field. You have no memory of anything like that ever happening?
No.
What could he possibly be thinking about?
I have no idea.
One of the things the New York Times suggested is that there was a helicopter trip he took in 2018 with former Governor Jerry Brown and Governor-elect Gavin Newsom. So Governor Jerry Brown, how often do you get confused with Jerry Brown?
Not too often. We've known each other for many, many years, simply because I was the only person that endorsed his candidacy when he first ran for governor back in the 70s. I then ultimately endorsed his candidacy again in the early 2000s when he ran for governor after being the mayor of Oakland. But I have never traveled anywhere with Jerry Brown or even the good man that's running for the Republican nomination in any kind of a helicopter.
Another thing that Donald Trump said at this news conference was that you had said derogatory things about Vice President Kamala Harris to him in conversation. Have you ever had a conversation like that with Donald Trump?
No, I have not, nor anybody else.
It sounds like, at least according to you, this entire story, including the helicopter, the near emergency landing, and the conversation about now Vice President Kamala Harris, it just never happened.
Never happened, period. And I think my memory is probably better than his.
We're talking tonight with the president's niece, Mary Trump, about her taped conversations with her aunt, the president's sister. Here are two more, Marianne Trump-Barry on Ivanka Trump and the height of the president's family separation, at the height of the president's family separation policy, and that of Eric Trump's place in the Trump pecking family order. Here it is.
When that damn Ivanka puts this picture of the Madonna and child on Instagram, when the big news of the day was how kids are being ripped from their families. I couldn't blame. I never heard of Samantha Bee before. I couldn't blame what she said. And meanwhile, Eric's become the moron publicly. Ivanka gives a shit. It's all about her.
Yeah, she's a mini Donald.
She's a mini Donald, but yet he's besotted with her. He always has been. She's always been his favorite.
I mean, it's interesting to me that that your aunt seems to have a very clear idea of what the president views the rest of his family as being like.
Oh, I understand. Well, like many bad parents, Donald is not subtle about which of his children he favors. So that's part of it, and that's something that's been part of the narrative in the family since they were kids.
Obviously, all of the president's adult children, they all spoke at the Republican convention. They are taking a very active political role. It's not, traditionally, people don't really cover the children of people who are in the White House when they're underage. But this is different, obviously, because Ivanka Trump has a role in the White House. Donald Trump Jr. is out on the campaign trail. Eric Trump is, I guess, running the organization or involved in it. You said that his relationship with his kids is very transactional. And, I mean, is that the lens he views everything through?
Yeah, he got that from my grandfather, who viewed life and business and his family as a zero-sum game. There could only be one winner. Everyone else loses. So in order to be the winner, which Donald was absolutely determined to be, you need to figure out how to maximize your advantage in any relationship you have.
It's interesting, think it was Rick Wilson has a book called, and I might be butchering the title, but it's Everything Trump Touches Dies. And it's an interesting idea to me that everybody in his orbit, it seems, harms themselves by, in one way or another, that nobody survives close contact for long without being diminished, whether it's their reputation, their livelihood, whatever it may be. And I'm wondering, is that something that resonates with you? I mean, do you think that's true?
Yeah, it's, I think we've seen example after example of that. And, my cousins are no exception to that. The difference is they know better than most people. And I think Jared Kushner is also included in this. They know better than anybody how to manipulate Donald in order to stay in his good graces. So they have, that's why they're still around. On the other hand, however, what have they sacrificed in order to do that? These are not independent people. They've never worked outside of the family business. Their money is family money. And they, in a sense, subsume themselves to their father's agenda.
I've never met somebody who is at the economic level that the president allegedly is, who is so easy to sort of pacify. I mean, it's so easy to appeal to. I mean, it's so transparent. All you need to do is say one or two nice things about his poll numbers or the size of his crowds, and you can see it at times washing over him, and it seems like then he sort of views, well, you've said nice things about him, and therefore that is sort of the lens through which he views everything.
Yeah, and this might sound odd, but that's actually one of the things that's most dangerous about him. And that's down to my grandfather. My grandfather, through various mechanisms, made Donald eminently useful to smarter, more powerful men. And you're right, it's extraordinarily easy to manipulate him with a few choice words. And in the process, get him to do what you want him to do without his actually even knowing it.
He gives himself away all the time on this. Even when he was asked recently about QAnon, this bizarre conspiracy theory based on anti-Semitic and anti-Catholic tropes, the first thing he said is, well, I hear they say very nice things about me. And he uses that line all the time, and it's so telling because that truly is the most important thing to him, and it's the lens through which he views it. Oh, this group says nice things about me, therefore there's no reason for me to view them critically.
Precisely. He did that with David Duke. I mean, although first he claimed not to know who David Duke was, but then it was fine with him because David Duke supported him. And that's literally all that matters to him. There has to be some currency involved that benefits him, whether it's praise or some financial benefit.
I just want to play another recording of your Aunt Marianne Barry Trump about Dreamers. Let's play this.
Well, what he did with the Dreamers. I mean, God. I'm so much in support. No, he changed his mind. I know. But he denies it. I mean, he would deny he changed his mind. Of course he would. He's all over the law.
Well, just like with the kids who are now in de facto concentration camps down in Texas, he's blaming the Democrats for it. It's the Democrats' horrible policy, which suggests that he thinks it's a bad thing, and yet he's allowing it to.
It's mind-boggling. Mind-boggling. But that's all about his base. All he wants to do is appeal to his base. He has no principles. None. And his base, I mean, my God, if you were a religious person, you want to help people, not do this.
Everything.
It's always interesting that or I think it was Donald Trump Jr. at the convention in 2000, before the election the last time, called him, I think, like the people's billionaire, that he somehow is sort of, really in touch with the working man and has been throughout his life. It seems to me his life is about running as far away from Queens, where his father lived, as possible, coming to Manhattan as quickly as possible and surrounding yourself with gold and shiny things. I've never understood that people actually seem to believe that when you look at the actual arc of his life.
It is astonishing. I think Donald would be totally incapable of negotiating the world if he were somehow dropped into it, first of all. And secondly, presenting him as a man of the people is a rather remarkable bit of alchemy. It's up there with claiming he's a man of faith who cares about other people's faith, or claiming he's a successful real estate developer and entrepreneur. I mean, none of those things about him is true. And yet that is how he continues to be sold, just as he continues to be sold. And I think that's a large part of what this convention was about, as an empathetic family man. It's all lies, honestly.
Mary Trump, thank you.
They arrived in vans. They arrived in SUVs.
Hi, guys.
Most of them co-workers, some of them friends. There were 19 of them, each with a story to tell. They all took the elevator to our studio. 3 elevators, in fact. What were all these people doing here? All of them wanted to talk about their years of working for Donald Trump's golf clubs. They also all have another thing in common.
Raise your hand, how many of you are undocumented workers? And how many of you worked for the Trump organization? Raise your hand. All of you.
All of them say they worked for Mr. Trump at his various golf courses in New York and New Jersey, some for more than a decade, despite being in the United States illegally, from countries including Mexico and Guatemala. They brought with them their work uniforms and stacks of pay stubs from their former employer. Jose Juarez worked as a waiter at Trump's Westchester Golf Club for 10 years and often served Donald Trump.
He used to come and we serve him a Diet Coke out of the glass bottle into a plastic cup with ice.
Do you think he knew where you were from?
Yes, he knew I was from Mexico.
You told him?
Yes.
Do you think the president knew that you were undocumented?
I think so.
This was an open secret.
Lawyer Anibal Romero represents 38 undocumented workers, including this group, all of whom worked at Trump properties. He says 11 of them were quietly fired in January from Trump's Westchester Club after the club did an audit in the midst of the government shutdown and the fight over the border wall. The rest of these workers quit given the toxic environment.
Some of these employees were the most trusted employees of the Trump family. They've been working there for 10, 15 years. Some of my clients had, the keys to, for example, Eric Trump's house in Westchester, New York.
Nearly all of these 19 undocumented workers told us they've met Donald Trump. Sandra Diaz is from Costa Rica and worked as a housekeeper for 4 years at Trump National Golf Club in New Jersey.
I work really close to him in his house. Always I with him, with Melania, with Ivanka. Always I stay inside the house with all the family. They know me. I have a keys. I have to go in. I have to take care all clothes, everything in this house. I have to care.
Sandra told us she believes Donald Trump knew she was here illegally because he has to sign off on everything at the club.
How do you feel when you hear the president say that people like yourselves shouldn't be in this country?
I feel really bad.
All of the workers paid taxes, but were not given benefits. Victorina Morales also worked at Trump's golf club in New Jersey as a housekeeper. For 5 years, she made Trump's bed and dusted off his golf trophies.
Did you ever tell the management at the golf course that you were undocumented or that you didn't have the right paperwork?
She told us yes. She told her supervisors, but was told legal papers didn't matter as long as she did the work.
What documents, ¿qué papeles did you show when you applied for the job?
Victorina says she didn't show any paperwork when she got the job, but in 2016 she was suddenly asked for legal documentation. She says when she told her manager she didn't have it, he got his cousin to take her to a house in New Jersey to get documents, and that her manager himself paid the $175 fee for her fake documents.
There was another client I have in Westchester who presented fake documents, and he was told that they didn't look good enough. So they had him return 3 times to get fake documents that looked better.
Did Donald Trump know where you were from, and do you think that he knew you were undocumented?
Victorina told me Trump once asked her where she was from, and she told him Guatemala. She says the majority of housekeepers were undocumented and that Trump must have known. Margarita Cruz worked as a housekeeper at Trump's golf club in Westchester, New York for 9 years.
What do you think when you hear Donald Trump talk about undocumented workers and how you shouldn't be allowed in this country, yet you worked at his golf club?
Margarita says Trump is a hypocrite, that he says they are bad people, rapists and traffickers, but they are honest, hard-working people who worked hard for him.
He's been benefiting from undocumented labor for many, many years. It's sad that he's been lying to the American people.
Randy joins us now. Has the Trump Organization had any response to what those workers told you?
Anderson, we reached out to the Trump Organization several times asking for a response to the fact that these allegations and also the fact that the Trump Organization has been employing these undocumented workers for years. We didn't get a response, but the Trump Organization has responded to the New York Times, which has also done some reporting on this issue, telling the Times they have strict hiring practices and that if an employee submits false documentation to circumvent the law, they will be fired immediately. Now, that's certainly not what these workers told us happened in their case. And that statement to the New York Times, Anderson, certainly doesn't answer our question, which is, did Donald Trump know that these undocumented workers were working for him as he was publicly railing against them? Right. Also, one other note, most of the workers in our story, they're all facing deportation because, as you know, there is no plan for those 11 million plus illegal immigrants in this country. Only one of them now has legal permanent status. That's Sandra Diaz, but she didn't get it until long after she left Trump's golf club in New Jersey, Anderson.
Our guests are Miguel Tinker-Salas, a Venezuelan professor at Pomona College in California. Jeffrey Sachs is with us here in New York, leading economist and director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University. He's recently co-authored a report for the Center for Economic and Policy Research headlined "Economic Sanctions as Collective Punishment: The Case of Venezuela." So much is being used against the presidency of Maduro, saying he's brought the country to an economic standstill. You make a different case, Jeffrey Sachs.
Well, it's not an economic standstill. It's a complete economic collapse, a catastrophe in Venezuela. There was a crisis, for sure, before Trump came to office. But the idea of the Trump administration from the start has been to overthrow Maduro. That's not a hypothesis. Trump was very explicit in discussions with presidents of Latin America where he asked them, why shouldn't the U.S. just invade? He said that already in 2017. So the idea of the Trump administration has been to overthrow Maduro from the start. Well, the Latin leaders said, no, it's not a good idea. We don't want military action. So the U.S. government has been trying to strangle the Venezuelan economy. It started with sanctions in 2017 that prevented essentially the country from accessing international capital markets and the oil company from restructuring its loans. That put Venezuela into a hyperinflation. That was the utter collapse. Oil earnings plummeted. The earnings that are used to buy food and medicine collapsed. That's when the social humanitarian crisis went spiraling out of control. And then in this year is with this idea, very naive, very stupid in my view, that there would be this self-proclaimed president, which was all choreographed with the United States very, very closely. Another round of even tighter sanctions, essentially confiscating the earnings and the assets of the Venezuelan government took place. Now Venezuela is in complete, utter catastrophe. A lot of it brought on by the United States deliberately, creating massive, massive suffering. We know there's hunger. We know there's incredible shortage of medical supplies. We can only imagine, because we won't know really until the dust settles and careful studies are done, how much excess mortality there is. But surely in a context like this, this is a catastrophe largely created by the U.S. because, as was said earlier, this is an all-or-nothing strategy. What Trump just doesn't understand, and what Bolton, of course, never agrees to, is the idea of negotiations. This is an attempt at an overthrow. It's very crude, it's not working, and it's very cruel because it's punishing 30 million people.
How did you come up with the number 40,000 dead as a result of these crippling U.S. sanctions?
Let me be clear. Nobody knows. This was a very basic, simple calculation based on estimates of universities in Venezuela that mortality had increased by a certain proportion after the sanctions. I don't want anyone to think that there's precision in these numbers. What is certain, though, staring us in the face, is that there is a humanitarian catastrophe deliberately caused by the United States, by what I would say are illegal sanctions, because they are deliberately trying to bring down a government and trying to create chaos for the purpose of an overthrow of a government.
Why?
Why are they doing that? This is normal U.S. right-wing foreign policy, nothing different. This is the same foreign policy that we saw throughout Latin America in the 20th century. It's the same foreign policy that we saw catastrophically in the Middle East. This is Mr. Bolton. This is Mr. Bolton's idea of diplomacy. This is Trump's idea of diplomacy. You punch someone in the face, you crush your opponent, you try whatever way you can to get your way. It's very simple-minded, it's very crude, and it never works. It just leads to catastrophe.
I want to bring Miguel Tinker-Salas back into this conversation, professor at Pomona College. As these protests were taking place or this coup attempt was taking place in Venezuela, in Honduras, there were massive protests against privatization, also huge demonstrations in Paris. You certainly don't get the same kind of coverage.
No, you don't. And the reality is that what's happening in Honduras is fundamental. You have an effort of privatization. You have layoffs of doctors and of professors and of teachers. And there's massive street protests happening in Tegucigalpa and all the major cities. And the attention is all on Venezuela. The same thing is happening in other contexts for Central America. The immigration that's happening as a result of failed U.S. policies. As our colleague was saying earlier, the reality is this was tried elsewhere. The regime change that's being tried in Venezuela has been tried elsewhere in Latin America and has led to humanitarian crisis throughout Central America, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, in Mexico until very recently. So again, we know the formula. We know it doesn't produce the change that most people want. And what it does is it aggravates conditions for the majority of the population. So you have, in the case of Venezuela, mistakes made by the Maduro administration that are now exacerbated by the sanctions and that take a toll on humans and on the population of the country.
We've been showing for our radio audience video, just to let you know, of the tear gassing of people in Paris and Honduras right now. Of course, Honduras is a U.S. ally. We're not getting as much coverage of this. Finally, I wanted to ask Jeffrey Sachs about this issue you raise of collective punishment and saying that collective punishment of a civilian population, as described by both the Geneva and Hague International Conventions, to which the U.S. is a signatory, and that way.
And I would say of the OAS also, which explicitly prohibits this kind of hostile action against another country. U.S. sanctions are now being imposed to bring down governments everywhere. You have similarly in Iran yesterday, big announcement of the collapse of the Iranian economy, and the IMF attributed it to U.S. sanctions. So this is what the Trump administration is trying to do also vis-a-vis Nicaragua. Trump said yesterday, total blockade on Cuba if they don't smart up. This is pure bullying. It is completely against international law. It creates havoc. It's hard enough to achieve economic progress, but when the U.S. is using its political power to break other countries, the results absolutely can be devastating. And we see it in Venezuela, that it was the kick that pushed Venezuela into this catastrophic spiraling decline and hyperinflation. It's always blamed in our press on Maduro, but people don't even look and understand how the U.S. has the instruments of sanctions, blocking access to financial markets, pushing enterprises into default, blocking trade, confiscating the assets owned by the Venezuelan government, precisely to, and with the design of creating this kind of crisis, because the idea is if the pain is enough in the thinking of people like Bolton, then there will be a military overthrow. So they're trying to create absolute disaster. Well, what's so stupid about these American policies, these neocon policies, is they do create disaster, but they don't achieve even the political goals of these nasty people like Bolton. It's not as if they're effective and nasty. They're completely ineffective and totally nasty at the same time. But Congress, in our country, nobody looks. It's unbelievable that you have this basically one-man show of Trump doing damage, rampaging around the world. There's no oversight at all. And in the international institutions like the IMF, the Inter-American Development Bank, people are scared to even say the truth, that this bully of the United States, especially with the kind of president we have right now, no one wants to speak the obvious facts of how much damage is being done. How many lives are being lost, how much suffering is being created, how many refugees are being created deliberately. And then, of course, you get the New York Times or someone else saying it's Maduro's whatever, because they don't even look at the obvious the obvious process.
And you have Democratic leaders as well in Congress saying the same thing. And so we're going to turn right now to a Democrat in Congress. We want to thank Jeffrey Sachs, who is a leading economist, director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University. We'll link to your report that you put out with the Center for Economic Policy Research, headlined Economic Sanctions as Collective Punishment, the Case of Venezuela. And Miguel Tinker-Salas, thanks for joining us, professor at Pomona College in California.
Tonight, somehow even more Trump allies are now facing charges for trying to overturn the 2020 election. This time in Wisconsin, and a total, if you look at this, across 5 battleground states, 52 people are now facing charges. 2 of those who were charged in Wisconsin have shown up and passed fake elector indictments. Kenneth Chesebro, who has already pleaded guilty, I should note, in the Georgia case, the same case where Donald Trump himself is charged. Chesebro is also an unindicted co-conspirator in Arizona. Also charged in Wisconsin now, Mike Roman, who was also charged both in Georgia and Arizona. Then there is also a former Trump attorney, Jim Troupis, who is here with me now to talk about all of this, CNN senior legal analyst and former assistant U.S. attorney Ellie Honig, as well as CNN political commentator and Trump's former White House communications director, Alyssa Farah-Griffin. Ellie, I just want everyone to listen to what the Attorney General of Wisconsin had to say about why they're bringing these charges now.
But I will say that our focus in any investigation, in any prosecution, is not on the speed with which something's done. It's on doing high-quality investigations, conducting high-quality prosecutions, and getting things right. That's the approach we have taken.
Defending the timeline here, but what do you make of how long it took to bring these charges?
That's boilerplate. I expect that of any prosecutor, but it's also completely unconvincing. It took 3.5 years
to bring these charges? I mean, it's 3.5 years ago that this all happened. He's been the AG throughout that time. He's been AG since 2019. I understand investigations take time. I've done plenty of investigations. There is no way an investigation yielding these 3 charges should have taken 3.5 years. And by the way, if you look at the indictment, most of that material is already contained in the other indictments that we've seen. He didn't uncover that much new. There's some new stuff relating to Wisconsin, but I do need to say the indictment looks fairly strong to me. I mean, it does seem like this was a forgery and a fraudulent scheme. So they seem to have the evidence, but the timing, that explanation does not suffice.
I wonder, Alyssa, just what it's like for you to see this, given obviously you were inside the Trump White House in those final few weeks. And while all of this was going on in the campaign and in these battleground states, what it's like to continue to see. I mean, the headline's it's not even the first story that we talk about, which is really remarkable because now we've just seen so many of these fake elector schemes and the indictments that have followed.
I mean, it's crazy, it's historic, it's unprecedented how many advisors of the former president are either in jail now, likely going to face jail time in the future, and yet so many people are lining up wanting to work for him again, wanting him to win the election. I mean, I think of the fact that Peter Navarro, who was in my office in the West Wing very regularly, is literally sitting in jail right now. There's a point where it's like you have to realize that the associates around Donald Trump are not themselves just stepping in it. They're following the lead of Donald Trump. He himself obviously has been indicted on 88 felony counts and charged in these 34 in New York. I mean, this is the company he keeps and it's the person he is.
I want to bring into this discussion Jessica Leeds, who testified during the trial. She told jurors about how Trump groped her during a flight on a plane in the 1970s. In 2018, Jessica Leeds came to our Democracy Now! Studio here in New York and described what happened when she sat next to Trump in first class on the flight.
Dinner was served, and it was after dinner when truly, all of a sudden, without a word, without a buy you leave or about any kind of social conversation, he started groping me.
What does that mean? What did he do?
His hands were he was trying to kiss me. His hands were on my breast. He was, we were kind of wrestling, but I didn't say anything. He didn't say anything, so it was like this kind of kabuki theater in the silence. I remember thinking, why doesn't the guy across the aisle say something? Why doesn't the stewardess come back? But it seemed to go on forever, but of course it didn't.
He put his hand up your skirt?
Yes, he started putting his hand up my skirt. And that's when I, with effort, managed to wiggle my way out, grabbed my purse, and I went to the back of the airplane. And I sat there until the plane landed and was completely clear because I didn't want to run into him.
Released more secretly taped conversations, and this latest snippet focuses on Stormy Daniels, the porn star to whom Donald Trump funneled hush money. And after hearing what the First Lady had to say about her, Stormy Daniels is responding.
Stormy Daniels is lashing out after being called a porn hooker by First Lady Melania Trump. In a secretly recorded tape made 2 years ago, Melania can be heard expressing frustration after learning that Stormy Daniels was about to appear in a high-profile Vogue magazine fashion shoot by famed photographer Annie Leibovitz. The tapes were made by Melania's former friend, Stephanie Winston Wolkoff.
Annie Leibovitz shot the porn hooker.
What do you mean she shot the porn hooker?
Stormy.
Shut the up. For what?
Oh, you didn't read it? Yeah, it was yesterday came out. For Vogue. She will be in Vogue. Annie Leibovitz shot her.
Unlike other first ladies like Michelle Obama, Melania has never been asked to appear in Vogue. Stormy, who says she had a brief fling with the president in 2006, is hitting back today with a vulgar tweet, only parts of which we can show on TV. Ha ha ha. Although I wasn't paid for sex and therefore technically not a hooker, I'll take being that over what you are any day. The tapes of the First Lady were released by Stephanie Wolkoff to publicize her new book, Melania and Me. The tapes are quite eye-popping. Who knew the First Lady spoke like this in private?
talk more about Donald Trump, we're joined now by David K. Johnston, who's followed Trump's career for decades. His biography of Trump has just been published. It's titled The Making of Donald Trump and examines Trump's rise to prominence. David K. Johnston is a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter, previously with the New York Times, now a columnist for the Daily Beast. Welcome back to Democracy Now! It's nice to have you in studio. Why don't we start off with your response to what Trump said yesterday?
Well, I've been listening to right-wing radio about this, and all sorts of people saying, there goes the liberal media again. He never said that. He certainly said it to people who are zealots, people who are deranged, people who are dangerous. And without question, this was way beyond the pale. But, you know, this will happen again. This is who Donald Trump is. He is a bully. He is someone who believes that whatever he thinks is in his interest in the moment is in the national interest.
Well, David, you've been following Trump now for decades, going back to even back when you were, what, a bureau chief for the Philadelphia Inquirer in Atlantic City, yes, when he was beginning to get his casinos going there in Atlantic City. What's been the main thread that you've taken away from your years of studying his operations?
Donald doesn't know anything. And if you listen carefully to what he says, it becomes apparent. He was asked by Hugh Hewitt during one of the debates, the right-wing radio talk show host, about the nuclear triad. That's the capacity of the U.S. to deliver a nuclear bomb from a submarine missile, a land-based missile, or an airplane. His answer indicated he had no idea. Well, it turned out Hugh Hewitt had asked the same question months earlier on his radio show, and Trump didn't learn in between. Trump talks as if the president's a dictator. When he ran casinos, he didn't know the games, he didn't know the odds, he didn't know how to handle customers. All he knew how to do was take money out of the organization, which weakened it, and that's why his casinos were among the first to fold.
Let's go back to the clip that you reference, also in The Making of Donald Trump. During the Republican debate last December, he was questioned, as you said, by Hugh Hewitt, who then asked Senator Marco Rubio for his response.
I do. Well, first, let's explain to people home what the triad is. Maybe a lot of people haven't heard that terminology before. The triad is our ability of the United States to conduct nuclear attacks using airplanes, using missiles launched from silos or from the ground, and also from our nuclear subs. Ability to attack. And it's important. All three of them are critical.
So that was Senator Rubio, and before him, Donald Trump. And, of course, then there was recently Joe Scarborough, the talk show host, who's a former Republican conservative Congress member, saying he heard from an international diplomat who was advising Donald Trump. Trump said to the person 3 times, if we have nuclear weapons, why don't we use them?
Well, this is indicative of Donald doesn't know anything. I mean, if Marco Rubio, who is pretty much an empty suit, has to school you on something this basic, that should have screamed to people back in December, this man has no qualifications. He doesn't qualify to be in Congress, much less be president of the United States. On the other hand, in his own mind, of course, Donald is the greatest living person. And Amy, if you don't appreciate that, Donald has a word for you. Loser.
Well, David, I wanted to ask you about this issue, which we discussed previously with Wayne Barrett as well, on the issue of Donald Trump's relationship to the mob and his connections over the years to mobsters. And you've also looked into that as well.
Yes, and it's not just the traditional mafia families in New York. First of all, Donald Trump's father had a business partner who was a mob guy. I'm sure Wayne talked about that. But Donald has done business with people with the Russian mob. He's done business with con artists. The guy who supplied his helicopters and managed his personal helicopter, called the Ivana, from his first wife back then, was a major cocaine trafficker who actually handled the drugs. And after he went to prison, Donald wrote a letter pleading for mercy for him. So he got 18 months as the head of the ring. The little fish who delivered the drugs, they got 20 years. Donald he continued to do business with him after he was indicted. Donald has done business all his life with mobsters and criminals because it's a way to make money.
Can you talk about Joseph Weichselbaum?
Yes, that's the guy. Joseph Weichselbaum is this mob associate. He used to do cigarette boat racing in Miami, and he once came in third right behind Charles Keating, the infamous financier who ripped off people for $1 billion. And Weichselbaum provided helicopters to the Trump organization, even though there were better capitalized, better run companies. Donald rented an apartment to Weichselbaum and his brother under very unusual circumstances. When Wexelbaum was indicted, it was for a drug operation that went from Miami to Ohio. When he agreed to plead guilty, the case was mysteriously moved to New Jersey. And who did it come before? Federal Judge Marianne Trump Berry, Donald's older sister. No one knows how this happened. Now, she removed herself from the case, but imagine, Amy, that you or one of the listeners, you're the chief judge, and a judge comes to you and says, oh, I can't handle this case because I fly in this drug trafficker's helicopters. My husband flies in them every week. My children have flown in this drug trafficker's helicopters. You know, it helps explain how this guy got a light sentence. And the question we have to ask is, why did Donald Trump need to write that letter, which could have cost him his casino license? Because he needed this guy to be his friend and not his enemy. What was going on that Donald Trump needed a drug trafficker to be his friend and not his enemy? And that's a question no one in the news media has been asking.
You got a call. You got a call from Donald Trump over this?
I got a call related to this, yes. I wrote a piece for Politico magazine back in April about all of Donald Trump's connections, and Donald finally called me. He's had my home number for years. He's called me at home in the past. And he said to me, well, you know, you wrote a lot of things I like, but if I don't like what you write, I'm going to sue you. I said, well, Donald, you're a public figure. In America, that means that he would have to prove that I deliberately, knowingly told a lie about him. And he said, I know I'm a public figure, but I'll sue you anyway. And it's one of the reasons the news coverage of him has been so soft. He has threatened to sue everybody. That Politico piece that I wrote, I've been in investigative reporting for almost 50 years. I've never been lawyered like I was for that piece, and it didn't have anything that hadn't been published before in it. He has intimidated the news organizations, and they're not willing to talk about that.
Well, in your book, you go into a story not about his father, who's been well known and covered previously by other publications, but about his grandfather. Can you talk about Donald Trump's grandfather?
Donald Trump's grandfather, Friedrich, when he turned 16 in 1885, was subject to mandatory military service in Germany. So he fled the country and came to America, and then he followed Horace Greeley's advice, go west, young man. And he went into the whorehouse business. And he ran bordellos in Seattle, in Everett, Washington, and in the Yukon Territory until the Royal Canadian Mounted Police showed up. He then took his fortune, went back to Germany, married a young woman his mother didn't approve of, came back to America. His wife didn't like it. They went back to Germany. He figured with all his money he could buy his way in. And they said, you're a draft dodger, get out, and sent him back to America.
And then talk about his father, Fred Trump.
Well, Fred Trump, whose father died when he was 12 or 13 years old, is a very industrious guy. When he was 15 years old, he started a business, technically owned by his mother, because he couldn't sign contracts, building garages in the outer boroughs of New York for these newfangled thing called automobiles. When the market collapsed because of the Great Depression, he invented one of the first grocery stores. People used to have clerks give them their canned goods and stuff. He opened one where you did your own and then sold it for a profit. He built housing during World War II for shipyard workers and is said to be the first person in line to get federal money to build worker housing. He was a profiteer. Dwight D. Eisenhower personally went into a rage over what he had done, how he'd ripped stuff off, and he had a creative explanation when he was called before the U.S. Senate to justify what he did. He said, I didn't profiteer. I didn't take the money. It's in the bank account. Strange way to think about things. And of course, they discriminated against everybody who wasn't white, and were proven to have done this in the 50s and in the 70s. And Woody Guthrie, the folk singer, This Land Is Your Land, he wrote a song, which is in the book, thanks to the generosity of the Guthrie family, about one of the all-white outer suburb projects owned by Fred Trump.
That he had an apartment in.
Yes, that's right, that he lived in.
You tell a story about Fred Trump's son, his older son, Donald Trump's brother, and what happened to his family, and particularly his grandchild, after the father, Fred Trump, died, and what Donald Trump did to him.
So keep in mind he sought mercy for a drug trafficker. So Freddie Trump Jr. died of alcoholism early. And when old man Trump died, he had a new grandson, a great-grandson who was born a few days later. Very sickly child, nearly died several times. Huge medical bills. Everyone in the Trump family gets medical insurance from the Trump organization. Donald is a big believer in health care. It's one of the positive things you can say about him. And the line of Freddie Trump Jr., when they realized they'd been effectively cut out of the will, filed a lawsuit. hey, you guys are dividing the money up 4 ways instead of 5. Donald immediately cut off the health care for this sickly child.
This is his grandnephew.
His grandnephew. And he's asked about this, and he says, well, I don't like people who sue my father. And he was said, well, don't you think this will look cold-hearted? You're putting the life of this child in jeopardy. Well, what else am I to do? And that's an essential element to understanding Donald Trump. You don't exist, Amy. I don't exist as a person. That's why he talks about women the way he does in these degrading terms. Donald doesn't see other people as people. He sees them as things to be used. And put the life of a child in jeopardy for more money? Donald thinks nothing is wrong with that. That's, of course you would do that if you're done. If you wouldn't do it, what's wrong with you? That would be Donald's attitude.
And the issue of Donald Trump's tax forms, this has continually come up over this campaign. Why haven't you released your tax returns? You've looked into this whole issue of why he's so reluctant to show what his real returns are.
Right, and tax has been my big area of specialty. I'm actually writing a whole new federal tax code for the United States.
In your spare time.
Yeah. Donald Trump, we know, paid no federal income taxes in 1978, 1979. He and I had lunch and talked about it once. In 1984 and in the 90s. The 1984 tax return is very revealing. There are special laws in America for full-time real estate people that allow them to live tax-free if they own a lot of property. So if Donald gave us his tax returns, I could tell you what his property is really worth as opposed to what he tells people it's worth. That's one reason he's not going to give it out. I don't think he's anywhere near as wealthy as he claims, not even close. But in 1984, he was audited by the state of New York and the city of New York, which both have income taxes. He filed a tax form, not the whole return, that showed zero income for this category of income and over $600,000 of deductions. Surprise, surprise, the auditor said, please justify these deductions. He couldn't do it. But he ordered his tax guy to make an appeal. And under oath, his longtime tax guy is shown the return that was filed, and he goes, that's my signature, but I didn't prepare that document. That's very good evidence of tax fraud. And Donald is engaged in other tax frauds we know about. He was involved in what's called the empty box scandal here in New York. That's where you claim to not live in the state, and you have an empty box mailed to you out of state to avoid sales tax. In that case, when Donald found out there was an investigation, he did what he often does to not be investigated. He ran to law enforcement and ratted out other people.
But in the 84 case, if there was evidence of fraud, what happened with that case?
We only know what happened in the city and the state case, all right? The state imposed penalties on him, civil penalties, not criminal. That's how almost all tax matters are settled. The city, because no one could find the original, all they had was the photocopy with the signature on it. The judge didn't impose the penalties because of the uncertainty about it, but he made it very clear that he thought this was a very fishy case. What the IRS did, I don't know. In all likelihood, Donald, who says he's audited all the time, arranges to settle these cases, but through threats of litigation, when they do the legal algebra, they say, all right, we'll take pennies on the dollar, get out of here, because they don't have the staff to pursue it.
You write a lot about the DGE, that's the New Jersey Division of Gaming Enforcement, which oversees the Atlantic City casinos. What can we learn from their dealings with Donald Trump?
Well, this shows how masterful Donald Trump is at manipulating law enforcement. He told the Attorney General of New Jersey when he wanted a casino license, I'm not going to go through the 18 months that all these other people have gone through, and demanded he be investigated in just 90 days. Everybody else, year and a half. The Attorney General agreed to 6 months if Donald cooperated. Then Donald hid things, including 4 grand jury investigations that Wayne Barrett found, 4 of them. In New Jersey, a woman applying for a blackjack dealer license, that's a very low-level license, was found morally unfit and denied a license because as a teenager she gave friends of hers discounts at the cash register. That's the legal standard. Donald withheld these grand jury investigations. He withheld associations with mobsters and criminals, and yet he got licensed anyway. Well, once he was licensed, the bureaucracy at the Division of Gaming Enforcement made sure that Donald was never asked a question that would put his license in jeopardy, because that would force them to admit that they hadn't done their job.
Well, given this history of lying, of fraud, of all of these other skirtings of the law, have you been surprised at all about this, the enormous support that Trump has gotten among the Republican faithful?
One, I'll tell you why I'm not surprised. As you two know, I've spent more than 20 years of my life being in the forefront in the mainstream press of documenting inequality. When nobody else was writing about it, I was showing how government policies are taking from the many and giving to the few. So the people in this country living in economic terror, the bottom 50%, I've been their advocate, but they're not people who read my books. What they know is I'm working harder, I'm making less. If I lose my job, I don't know how I'll pay my rent or keep a roof over my kids' heads. And Donald comes along like all demagogues do. I have a solution. It's the Mexicans, it's the Muslims, it's the Chinese, and people gravitate to them. They're not the only ones, but that's a big part of his support.
You write about how many of his restaurants, his golf courses, has 5 and 6 diamond awards. Yes. What are these?
Well, you go to at least 19 Trump properties that have these big plaques, 6 diamond award, 5 diamond awards. They're awards Donald gave to himself. Donald and his family were the majority of the board of something called the Academy of American Hospitality Sciences or something like that, which is the invention of a mob guy, a convicted art thief named Joey Nosaks, who lives on Central Park South. And Donald has gone to ceremonies to receive these awards and these big plaques, and his signature is on them. This is a man who gives awards to himself. How juvenile.
What were you most surprised by as we wrap up this interview in writing The Making of Donald Trump? You have covered him for many years.
I did not appreciate until I worked on the book that while Donald holds himself out as a devout Christian, no one reads the Bible more than me. Well, he has all these pastors embracing him as a good Christian man. Donald aggressively, thoroughly, and at great length in many forums denounces Christianity. His personal motto is always get revenge, whereas the message of Jesus Christ was turn the other cheek. And these ministers, some of whom I've written to and they haven't responded at all, continue to embrace him. And I find that very troubling. Donald has beguiled them with flattery. If they continue, now that my book is out, if they know about it to do this, they are then deceiving their flocks, and that's evil. But Donald himself doesn't care about these things. He will tell you any lie. He can't quote a single line from the Bible, not one. And yet he says, no one reads the Bible more than Donald Trump. If you ask him, well, what do you like in the Bible? Oh, there's so many. There's so many. There's so many I can't choose.
The courts in several different states are finding different things about Trump. Is there anything that could happen with him indictment-wise that would say, all right, maybe this disqualifies him for president?
Not for me. I'm with him to the finish.
All right, thank you so much.
He could stand on the front steps of the White House and commit murder, and I'm with him.
We had somebody earlier tell us that if Trump was standing on the steps of the White House and murdered someone, he'd still vote for him. Same with you?
Mm-hmm.
How come?
I don't know. I like Trump.
If Trump committed murder, he would still support him. That goes against, what my belief is in regard to most Trump supporters who just, it's not that they support his criminality, it's just that they don't believe his criminality to be true. But in this particular case, clearly this supporter doesn't really care too much about potential criminality or if he literally committed murder, which blows my mind.